What happens when a powerful corporation thinks they can silence anyone who threatens their empire only to discover their target holds the highest authority in the judicial system? This is a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice and power. Before we dive into this incredible tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you love stories of resilience and justice prevailing against all odds, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more amazing stories. Your support helps us bring these powerful narratives to light. Now let's begin. The glass towers of downtown Phoenix gleamed under the harsh afternoon sun, their reflective surfaces creating a maze of light and shadow on the bustling streets below. Between the towering monuments to corporate power, smaller buildings fought for space, creating a stark reminder of the city's economic divide. Margaret Chen walked purposefully along the sidewalk, her tailored charcoal suit impeccable despite the desert heat. Her leather portfolio, worn but well-maintained, contained documents that could reshape the landscape of environmental law. At 62, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the complex corridors of federal courts. She had just left a confidential meeting with environmental activists, reviewing evidence of illegal waste dumping by Phoenix Industrial Group, one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates in the Southwest. The meeting had run late, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the concrete. Margaret didn't notice the black SUV that had been following her for the past 3 blocks. Inside the vehicle, Director of Corporate Security James Morrison adjusted his tie and spoke into his earpiece. His 15 years in private security had taught him how to handle problems for his corporate clients with ruthless efficiency. Phoenix Industrial Group paid him handsomely to ensure their business interests remained protected. Subject is approaching the target zone, Morrison said, his voice cold and professional. Asian female, approximately 60, carrying what appears to be legal documents. Initiate contact protocol. His partner, a younger man named Stevens, looked uneasy. Boss, she looks like a businesswoman. Are you sure about this approach? Morrison's jaw tightened. Phoenix Industrial doesn't pay us to second guess. That woman just spent 2 hours with environmental terrorists planning to destroy American jobs. She's an enemy of economic progress. The SUV pulled alongside Margaret as she reached a relatively quiet stretch of sidewalk. Morrison stepped out, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. He wore a dark suit that barely concealed the security equipment on his belt. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you," Morrison said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. Margaret paused, assessing the situation with the calm precision that had served her well in countless high-stakes legal battles. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" Morrison flashed a leather wallet containing what appeared to be some form of official identification, though he closed it too quickly for her to read the details. "Corporate security investigation. You've been identified as possessing materials relevant to an ongoing case." Margaret's eyebrows raised slightly. "Corporate security for whom, exactly? And what materials are you referring to?" "Phoenix Industrial Group," Morrison replied, stepping closer in an obvious intimidation tactic. "You were seen meeting with known environmental extremists. I need to examine the contents of your briefcase." Margaret held her ground, her voice remaining calm but firm. "I'm afraid I don't consent to any such search. You have no legal authority to detain me or examine my personal property." Morrison's expression darkened. In his world, people didn't refuse demands from corporate security, especially not middle-aged women walking alone. "Ma'am, I'm trying to handle this professionally. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Stevens approached from the passenger side, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the encounter was taking. "Jim, maybe we should." "Stay back," Morrison snapped, never taking his eyes off Margaret. "Ma'am, for the last time, I need to see those documents. You can cooperate now, or we can do this the hard way." Margaret set her briefcase down carefully, her movements deliberate and measured. "Young man, I suggest you reconsider your approach. You're operating under several dangerous misconceptions about your authority. Morrison laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Authority? Lady, I represent a $50 billion corporation with more legal firepower than you can imagine. Your little environmental friends won't help you now. Before Margaret could respond, Morrison grabbed her briefcase and yanked it from her hand. Papers scattered across the sidewalk, some catching in the desert wind. Margaret instinctively moved to gather them, but Morrison pushed her back. That's enough, she said, her voice carrying a new edge of steel. You've just committed assault and theft. I strongly advise you to return my property immediately. Morrison opened the briefcase, rifling through its contents with deliberate disrespect. Legal briefs, environmental impact studies, and court documents fluttered in the breeze. Look at this, Stevens. Our environmental terrorist has quite a collection here. Looks like she's planning to file some kind of lawsuit. Stevens shifted nervously, watching pedestrians begin to gather at a distance. Morrison, people are watching. This doesn't feel right. Nothing's right about eco-terrorists trying to destroy American businesses, Morrison replied, holding up a legal document. What do we have here? Some kind of injunction paperwork? Margaret's patience, cultivated through decades of legal practice, was wearing thin. Return my documents immediately. You're interfering with official federal business. Morrison scoffed. Federal business? You're just another activist lawyer trying to line your pockets with frivolous lawsuits. Phoenix Industrial has dealt with hundreds like you. A small crowd began to form, drawn by the commotion. Several people held up their phones, recording the encounter. Margaret noticed the cameras and spoke clearly for their benefit. I am being unlawfully detained and my property has been stolen by corporate security personnel who have no legal authority to act in this manner. Morrison realized the situation was escalating beyond his control. He had expected a quick intimidation session, not a public confrontation. Everyone move along. This is private security business. An elderly man from the crowd called out, she didn't do anything wrong. Leave her alone. Morrison's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. He was used to operating in the shadows, not under public scrutiny. Sir, step back or you'll be interfering with a security investigation. Margaret seized the moment. These documents contain evidence of illegal environmental violations by Phoenix Industrial Group. This man is attempting to obstruct justice by preventing that evidence from reaching federal court. The crowd murmured angrily. Morrison realized he had lost control of the narrative. In desperation, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. That's it, he snarled, reaching for the zip-tie restraints on his belt. Ma'am, you're coming with us for questioning. Stevens grabbed Morrison's arm. Jim, we can't kidnap someone in broad daylight. She's not being kidnapped, Morrison snapped, pulling free. She's being detained for corporate security purposes. Phoenix Industrial has contracts with federal agencies that give us certain authorities. Margaret remained calm even as Morrison approached with the restraints. I strongly advise you to reconsider this course of action. You're making a mistake that will have far-reaching consequences. Morrison ignored her warning, roughly grabbing her wrists and securing them with the zip ties. The crowd erupted in angry shouts, but he was committed now. Stevens, get her in the vehicle. We're taking her to the Phoenix Industrial Security Facility. As they forced Margaret into the back of the SUV, she made eye contact with the man who had been recording the encounter. Make sure that video reaches the news media, she said clearly. And contact the FBI field office. Tell them Judge Margaret Chen has been unlawfully detained. Morrison froze. What did you say? But the SUV doors were already closed, and Stevens was pulling away from the crowd, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The Phoenix Industrial Group security facility occupied an entire floor of a gleaming downtown tower, its sterile corridors and windowless interrogation rooms designed to intimidate. Morrison had used this facility hundreds of times to interview environmental activists, union organizers, and corporate whistleblowers. The legal gray areas of private security work allowed him to operate with minimal oversight. Margaret sat in a small, windowless room, her wrists still secured with zip ties. The chair was deliberately uncomfortable, and harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Standard intimidation tactics that she recognized from her extensive knowledge of interrogation protocols. She remained composed, using the time to mentally catalog every violation of federal law that had occurred in the past hour. Kidnapping, assault, theft of government documents, obstruction of justice. Morrison was accumulating felonies at an alarming rate. Morrison entered the room carrying her briefcase and a steaming cup of coffee that he placed just out of her reach. Another intimidation technique. He sat across from her, spreading her documents across the metal table with deliberate casualness. "So, Judge Chen," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's quite a story you told back there." "Federal judge, really?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "It's not a story. It's a fact that you can easily verify with a simple internet search." Morrison laughed. "Lady, I don't know what game you're playing, but I've been in security for 15 years. You think I haven't heard every lie in the book? Everyone's a lawyer, a judge, or connected to someone important when they get caught." "Then verify it," Margaret said simply. "Call the federal courthouse. Check the public records. Contact the FBI field office. A simple Google search would suffice." Morrison's confidence wavered slightly, but his pride prevented him from showing it. "Nice try. You environmental extremists are getting more creative with your cover stories." He opened her briefcase and began examining its contents more carefully. Legal documents bearing the seal of the United States District Court, correspondence on official federal judiciary letterhead, and most damning of all, a leather credential holder that clearly identified Margaret Chen as a United States District Judge for the District of Arizona. Morrison stared at the credentials for a long moment, his face growing pale. Stevens, who had been standing near the door, approached the table. "What is it, boss?" Morrison handed him the credential holder with shaking hands. Stevens examined it, his eyes widening as he read the official seals and identification. "Morrison," Stevens whispered, "this looks real." "Really real." Morrison snatched back the credentials, studying them more closely. The federal seals, the official photographs, the security features, everything appeared authentic. A cold sweat began to form on his forehead. "It's got to be a fake," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "A really good fake." Margaret watched his growing panic with professional interest. "Mr. Morrison, you now have approximately 2 hours before my absence is noticed by the Federal Marshal Service. They monitor the whereabouts of all federal judges for security purposes." Morrison's hands trembled as he set down the credentials. "You're lying. Federal judges don't walk around meeting with environmental groups. Federal judges don't typically need to investigate corporate environmental crimes personally," Margaret replied. "However, when a corporation attempts to intimidate federal court staff and interfere with pending litigation, direct intervention becomes necessary." Stevens backed toward the door, his face white with terror. "Boss, if she's really a federal judge, we've just kidnapped a sitting member of the federal judiciary. That's like 25 years to life." Morrison spun around. "Shut up. She's not a real judge. This is all an elaborate setup." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Morrison, I've been presiding over federal cases for 12 years. I've sent corporate executives to prison for far less than what you've done today. Your only option now is to release me immediately and hope that cooperation might reduce your eventual sentence." Morrison's world was crumbling around him. Phoenix Industrial Group paid him to handle problems quietly, not to create federal incidents. If Margaret was telling the truth, and the evidence suggested she was, his career was over. "Prove it," he said desperately. "If you're really a federal judge, prove it." Margaret nodded toward her scattered documents. "Those environmental impact studies you so carelessly dismissed. They're part of a federal case I'm currently presiding over. Phoenix Industrial Group vs. Environmental Protection Coalition. I'm the presiding judge. Morrison frantically shuffled through the papers, finding the court documents. The case caption clearly showed Honorable Margaret Chen, presiding. His legs buckled, and he collapsed into his chair. Stevens was already at the door. I'm out of here, Morrison. This is insane. You've destroyed us. Wait. Morrison called out, but Stevens was gone, leaving him alone with the woman who could end not just his career, but his freedom. Margaret's voice remained calm. Mr. Morrison, at this moment, federal investigators are likely analyzing the video footage from downtown. The FBI field office has been contacted. The U.S. Marshal Service will soon be looking for me. You have perhaps 1 hour to minimize the damage to yourself. Morrison stared at her, realizing the full magnitude of his mistake. What do you want? I want you to release me immediately. I want my documents returned in the exact condition they were in before you scattered them across the sidewalk. And I want a full written confession of Phoenix Industrial Group's attempts to obstruct federal justice. Morrison's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Phoenix Industrial, CEO office. His hands shook as he answered. Morrison, what the hell is going on? Came the angry voice of CEO Richard Brennan. I've got news outlets calling about some incident downtown. They're saying our security team kidnapped a federal judge. Morrison looked at Margaret, who watched him with the patient expression of someone who had presided over countless moments of corporate reckoning. Sir, Morrison whispered, I think we have a problem. The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix buzzed with unprecedented activity. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the afternoon sky like metallic flowers. Federal agents moved purposefully through the building, their presence a visible reminder that an attack on the federal judiciary would not be tolerated. In courtroom 7, an emergency hearing was about to begin. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, her composure restored despite the ordeal of the past 6 hours. Her documents, carefully reorganized and now evidence in multiple federal crimes, lay before her in neat stacks. At the defendant's table, Phoenix Industrial Group's legal team looked shell-shocked. Their client's head of security had just been arrested by federal agents for kidnapping a federal judge. Their CEO was facing potential charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The company's stock price was in free fall. Morrison sat in a gallery, flanked by U.S. Marshals. The zip-tie restraints he had used on Margaret now seemed absurdly inadequate compared to the federal shackles around his wrists. His 15 years of corporate security experience had not prepared him for this moment. Judge William Patterson, Margaret's colleague and longtime friend, presided over the hearing. The irony was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. Margaret, the victim of the kidnapping, would normally be the one wearing the robes. This emergency hearing, Judge Patterson began, his voice carrying barely controlled anger, addresses one of the most serious attacks on the federal judiciary in recent memory. The defendant corporation's security personnel committed kidnapping, assault, theft of federal documents, and obstruction of justice against a sitting federal judge. Phoenix Industrial's lead attorney, David Kellerman, rose shakily. Your Honor, while we deeply regret the actions of our security contractor, we maintain that this was an unfortunate misunderstanding, not a deliberate attack on the judiciary. Judge Patterson's gaze was withering. Counselor, your security personnel ignored multiple warnings that they were dealing with a federal judge. They had ample opportunity to verify her identity but chose instead to proceed with what can only be described as state-sanctioned kidnapping. Margaret stood to address the court. Despite being the victim, her presence commanded immediate attention. Your Honor, may I address the court regarding the systematic nature of these violations? Proceed, Judge Chen. Margaret moved to the podium with the fluid confidence of someone equally comfortable on both sides of the courtroom. Your Honor, this was not an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. The evidence shows a deliberate pattern of corporate intimidation designed to obstruct federal environmental litigation. She gestured toward the evidence table. Phoenix Industrial Group has been using private security to intimidate witnesses, steal legal documents, and prevent environmental evidence from reaching federal court. My detention was simply the most brazen example of their systematic obstruction of justice. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Morrison slumped further in his seat, realizing that Margaret had far more evidence than just his individual crimes. Kellerman attempted to interject. "Your Honor, we object to these broader allegations." Judge Patterson cut him off sharply. "Counselor, your client's security personnel kidnapped a federal judge. You're in no position to object to anything." Margaret continued. "The documents stolen from my briefcase contain evidence of illegal waste dumping, falsified environmental reports, and attempts to bribe federal inspectors." Phoenix Industrial's response was not to address these violations, but to attempt to suppress the evidence through criminal means. She turned to face the gallery, her voice carrying the authority of 12 years on the federal bench. "This case represents a fundamental attack on the rule of law. When corporations believe they can kidnap federal judges to protect their interests, our entire system of justice is under threat." The courtroom was silent except for the clicking of news cameras. Morrison stared at the floor, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done. He had not simply detained an environmental activist, he had assaulted the federal judiciary itself. Judge Patterson leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, you will stand and face the court." Morrison struggled to his feet, his federal restraints clinking softly. Judge Patterson's voice carried the weight of the entire federal system. "Mr. Morrison, you have admitted to kidnapping, assault, theft of federal documents, and obstruction of justice against a sitting federal judge. These crimes strike at the heart of our judicial system. You will be remanded to federal custody pending trial, with no possibility of bail." Morrison's legs gave out, and the marshals caught him before he could collapse. 15 years of corporate security work had ended with federal felony charges that would likely result in decades in prison. Kellerman made one final attempt. "Your Honor, Phoenix Industrial Group requests the opportunity to demonstrate our cooperation with federal investigators." "Counselor," Judge Patterson interrupted, "your cooperation will be noted by the prosecutors who will soon be filing RICO charges against your client. This court finds clear evidence of corporate conspiracy to obstruct federal justice." Margaret returned to her seat, satisfied that justice was beginning to take its course. But she knew this was only the beginning. The evidence in her briefcase would fuel federal investigations that could topple one of the Southwest's largest corporations. As the hearing concluded, Morrison was led away in federal custody. His corporate security career was over, replaced by the prospect of spending his remaining years in federal prison. The man who had thought he could intimidate anyone was now facing the full weight of federal justice. Phoenix Industrial Group stock continued to plummet as news outlets picked up the story. CEO Richard Brennan faced congressional calls for hearings on corporate abuse of federal authority. The company that had thought itself above the law was discovering that there were some powers even $50 billion couldn't buy. Margaret gathered her documents, now evidence in multiple federal cases, and prepared to leave the courthouse. As she walked through the lobby, reporters shouted questions, but she maintained her judicial composure. Outside, a young law student approached her nervously. "Judge Chen, I'm graduating next month. After watching what happened to you today, I want to work in environmental law. How do I fight corporations this powerful?" Margaret paused, remembering her own younger self, full of idealism and determination. "The law is the most powerful weapon we have against corporate abuse. Use it wisely, use it courageously, and never forget that justice is stronger than any corporation." As Margaret walked away, her steps echoing against the courthouse marble, she reflected on the day's events. Morrison's attack had backfired spectacularly, providing her with evidence that would fuel environmental justice cases for years to come. The fight was far from over, but today had proven that even the most powerful corporations could not escape the long arm of federal justice. In the weeks that followed, Morrison's federal trial became a landmark case in corporate accountability. His kidnapping of a federal judge had exposed a vast network of corporate intimidation and environmental crimes. Phoenix Industrial Group faced multiple federal investigations, and several executives followed Morrison to federal prison. The environmental case that had started it all, Phoenix Industrial Group versus Environmental Protection Coalition, resulted in the largest environmental judgment in Arizona history. The company was forced to pay billions in cleanup costs and faced ongoing federal oversight. Morrison served as the primary witness in the federal case against his former employers, his cooperation earning him a reduced sentence of 12 years in federal prison. The man who had once intimidated environmental activists now spent his days in a federal facility, stripped of the corporate power that had once shielded him. Margaret continued her work on the federal bench, but the kidnapping had given her a new perspective on corporate abuse of power. She became a leading voice for judicial independence and corporate accountability, her experience serving as a powerful reminder that justice could not be intimidated or bought. Years later, the case remained a cornerstone of federal environmental law. Law students studied Morrison versus United States as an example of how corporate overreach could lead to devastating legal consequences. Phoenix Industrial Group, once a symbol of corporate power, became a cautionary tale about the limits of private authority. And Margaret Chen, the federal judge who had been kidnapped for carrying environmental evidence, continued her work ensuring that corporate power could never again threaten the independence of federal justice. The system had held. Justice had prevailed. And the rule of law had proven stronger than any corporate empire. What do you think about Judge Chen's courage in standing up to corporate intimidation? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story of justice prevailing against powerful interests, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible tales of resilience and courage.